that, I get to introduce someone that you probably haven't met yet. Dr. Kayla Perry is an assistant professor in entomology. And I have to say, I think it's pretty awesome that we now have a state extension specialist in forest entomology. I've been at OSU over 20 years, and it's been a long time since we had somebody in that position, that was really focused on some of our forestry aspects. And so we actually pick up a second entomologist come fall. So we're going to be full of a wealth of buggy talks. How about that? But today we're going to get a status update on emerald ash borer. I'm certain that if you've had any ash trees, you've dealt with this pretty green bug. I'm a woodland owner. I had a section of woods that had patches that were 100% ash. So I know the pain that some folks have had to deal with, and had a couple of timber sales to try to help the forest out. But Kayla's going to talk about, what those forests are looking like after emerald ash borer has impacted. So with that, Kayla, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me get out of this.
Thank you for the introduction.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Let's see if I can do this again. Okay, can you see my slide?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kathy and Marnie, for inviting me to give this talk. Very excited. I started at Ohio State as an assistant professor in August. So I'm in my first year working to build my research program. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about EAB biology, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Probably have people that are different levels of familiarity with EAB. Talk a little bit about different management strategies that are currently ongoing in Ohio, as well as in other states in the US. And then talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing over the years on emerald ash borer, particularly looking at ecological impacts, and then finish up with some remaining questions about emerald ash borer and where I see my research program answering some of these questions. So if we want to take a step back and think about biological invasions more broadly, we can see that the frequency of biological invasions has increased over time. Let me get my pointer. Okay. So this figure here is looking at cumulative pest detections here on the y-axis over time. So you can see this is several hundreds of years that we have been experiencing invasions within North America. And so this figure is particularly looking at forest insects and pathogens in the continental United States. And here in blue, we can see those cumulative pest detections over time for all exotic species. And we can see this has really increased in the mid-1800s. And then here in red, there's a subset of these exotic species that are being detected that are considered high impact exotic species. And so these are species that have significant ecological or economic impacts. They're often termed invasive species. And of course, a really great example of a high impact exotic species that has had ecological and economic impacts is emerald ash borer, which of course is the focus of this talk today. And so since EAB was accidentally introduced into North America, it's killed hundreds of millions of ash trees. So this is a buprested beetle. It's a wood boring beetle native to Asia. It was first detected in 2002 near Detroit, Michigan, but was likely introduced in the early 1900s. And so far, this beetle has spread to many states in the US, also into Canada, and every species of ash that it has encountered so far has been susceptible to some degree, the North American ash species. And there's also evidence that white fringe tree may be a suitable host for EAB as well. And if we think about the damage that emerald ash borer causes both as an adult and as a larvae, the level of damage and the impacts differs between these life stages. And so as an adult, EAB typically feeds on the foliage of ash trees. And so this damage is negligible. It does not have major impacts on the host. However, the larvae feed under the bark on the phloem, and this is this life stage, of course, that does the most damage. As it's feeding under the bark, it's creating these serpentine, grass-filled galleries that disrupts the flow of water and nutrients throughout the tree and essentially girdles the tree, particularly under high-density outbreak populations. And it's this girdling effect from the feeding of the larvae that kills the tree in the end. And EAB can attack and successfully develop in ash trees that are at least 1 inch in diameter. So this is a really large proportion of the ash population that is susceptible, to EAB, and that's why we've seen such high ash mortality and major impacts from this insect species. So quickly, I just wanted to review the EAB life cycle. So in May and June, we see adult emergence from their D-shaped exit holes, this characteristic shape that we all look for on ash trees to see if there's EAB. It's one of the signs. The adults emerge, they feed on the foliage of ash trees, and then around July, the adults mate and lay eggs. So the eggs appear this white milky color when they're first laid, and then they turn sort of this coppery brown over time. And so the eggs will hatch, the larvae will bore into the tree, and then that is when they feed and develop under the bark, creating these grass-filled serpentine galleries that we often see when we peel back the bark. Around October, April, the larvae will overwinter under the bark. It's this particular stage, this J-shaped pre-pupae stage that actually enters diapause and overwinters. And then in April, these J-shaped larvae or the pre-pupae will actually pupate, and then the adults will then emerge the following May or June. And so one really interesting, at least I think it's interesting, component of Ohio is that we've actually seen forested land increase over the last century within the state, which most people maybe don't think about. We've got a lot of ag land, but actually we've seen forest land increase, particularly at the expense of agricultural land. And as you can see here in this figure, we're seeing forested land increase in the southern portion of the state and also the eastern portion of the state. So here in this figure, that's represented in green. And you can sort of see how it's becoming more dense over time. So this is looking at national land cover data at these 4 points in time. And so it's important to consider forested resources in Ohio. We've seen an increase and how exotic species such as emerald ash borer may be impacting this really important resource within the state. If we take a closer look at, say, ash within the state, at one point in time, ash, or species within Fraxinus, represented about 10% of the tree cover within Ohio, and that's represented here in this figure. So these data are from 2009. And so you can see here also high abundance of ash, so we're looking at basal area here in the southern and eastern portions of the state, but there are also pockets in other regions. And so as the color darkens here, we've got greens, sort of a dark blue here, we're seeing increase in basal area within these regions. And if we take a closer look at these data, we can see that white ash in particular was very abundant within the state at one point in time with almost 4 billion estimated white ash trees. And so a question that we should think about when we think about the economic and ecological impacts of EAB is, what happens when a state loses 10% of their trees or close to it? So we also have data looking at how ash have declined throughout Ohio. And so here that's being shown in this figure. And we're comparing the change in the number of ash trees from 2006, so a few years after EAB was detected in North America, to 2016. And these data are particularly looking at a change in trees that are greater than 1 inch in diameter. So these are the trees that are susceptible to emerald ash borer. And here we can see that the ash resource in Ohio has been altered since 2006. There are changes throughout the state, but there's variability in sort of the direction and the degree of impact throughout the state. And so we see the greatest losses of ash in the northwestern portion of the state. So remember, EAB was first detected in Michigan. And so this is the area of Ohio that experienced the longest duration of impacts from EAB. So we would expect it to have the greatest losses of ash. And then we can see how emerald ash borer has dispersed throughout the state over time and how these impacts are now becoming statewide. We also see how there are some areas that have actually gained ash. And so this is likely due to abundant young ash in forests. And so as they grow and enter this 1-inch diameter size class, that's considered a gain. And so I would hypothesize that these areas that have experienced a gain have abundant young ash populations in their forests. And here this figure is showing the current distribution of EAB within the continental United States. It's a little out of date, so I added my own point over here because as of 2022, EAB is now present in Oregon, which is very sad. It has now made the jump to the West Coast. It's been previously found in Colorado, but now we also find it out west, which is very upsetting, but I guess not surprising. And so EAB is a good flyer, and the signs and symptoms of infestation have been cryptic. And so it's been very challenging to stay ahead of the advancing front and to detect low density populations of EAB. And so it is no longer federally regulated. It has been dispersing throughout the US and Canada. And so it's here to stay. And we need to understand the ecological impacts that it's having on forests and the fauna that live in forests, and also think about ways that we manage it moving forward because it's not going anywhere. And so Ohio, like Michigan, have experienced some of the longest duration of EAB impacts within North America. And so there's been a lot of time and money spent thinking about management for this insect, understanding its biology, understanding how we may reduce its impacts. And one of the major impacts that it's had, of course, and I'm sure we've all seen these dead ash trees, but widespread mortality following EAB invasion. Within forests, within landscapes, North American species have no innate resistance against EAB, and so EAB is able to kill healthy ash trees. So I wanted to talk briefly about some of the EAB management actions that have happened, focusing on post-outbreak forests, but of course these are also happening in outbreak forests at the leading edge of the EAB distribution. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about monitoring, and particularly the importance of monitoring in post-outbreak forests to understand low density populations, protecting high value ash. EAB is still here, so if you have an ash that you've been treating with insecticide, you need to continue doing it. A little bit about coarse woody debris, which is an area that I've studied, biological control, and then lingering ash. And so we're continuing to monitor EAB populations, both sort of at the leading edge, but also in post-outbreak forests. And one of the goals that I'm hoping to work on within my program is particularly to quantify low density populations. And so as emerald ash borer has killed many of the mature ash trees within Ohio, within Michigan, within these post-outbreak forests, we're expecting emerald ash borer populations to collapse, essentially because their host trees are rapidly disappearing. And so some of the questions that remain are, what population levels will EAB sort of sustain in post-outbreak forests? What are these low density population numbers look like, and how that might impact management down the road? And so, of course, you may have seen some of these traps. They're very commonly used, the purple panel traps. Sometimes these can also be green, and then the green Lindgren funnel traps, which is a personal favorite of mine because it doesn't include all that sticky goo that gets everywhere. As I mentioned, it is important to continue treating high-value trees in landscapes, or if there are particular trees that are have been treated with insecticide in parks, because EAB is still here and it still has the potential to kill those high-value trees. And so there's been a lot of research that has been done to look at the impact of systemic insecticides in particular, and they've shown to be successful in protecting ash trees. So of course, systemic insecticides, they're transported throughout the tree, and so they provide protection from the larvae feeding under the bark, on the vasculature, as well as the adults feeding on the leaves. So it's a very effective way to control EAB populations for particular high value trees. This isn't necessarily a management technique that can be conducted at the scale of an entire forest, but it does provide a means to protect ash trees and protect sort of genetic variation within these regions. And so we found imidacloprid and dinotefuran are valuable for soil treatments and trunk injections. And we've also seen that emamectin benzoate in particular can provide up to 2 years of control for EAB. So you don't have to treat quite as often. If you are planning to treat, particularly with the soil treatments, think about doing those in the spring because it tends to be more effective than in the fall. If you have more specific questions about the types of insecticides that are available and how you might administer them, there's a really great guide that you can find on emeraldashborer.info. It's a free PDF. I encourage you to check this out if you have additional questions about insecticide control and management. We've also seen that once ash trees die, they tend to fall to the ground and become a safety hazard. So if trees are not treated, they succumb to EAB. There's significant safety concerns surrounding what happens to these standing dead snags. And we received a lot of questions from management, park managers, homeowners about how quickly ash snags fall, how they fall, and what's the best way to deal with these safety hazards. And so one of the projects that I've done has been to look at the volume of ash logs or wood and how quickly these snags have fallen in forests. And so here this figure is showing the percentage of ash that have fallen. So these are logs that are on the ground. And then here on the x-axis, we have years since 90% ash mortality. So these are years since a stand has been characterized as significantly impacted by EAB, where 90% of the trees are dead. Okay. And then we did this work in some Michigan state forests and parks, and we surveyed the percentage of fallen ash in 2008, which is shown here in the black circles. And then we went back to these same plots in 2012 and resampled the amount of fallen ash. So we've got 2 time points here. And essentially what we found was that the volume of downed ash in the forest doubled in about 4 years. And so this is fairly quickly. Once a stand is significantly impacted by ash mortality, you see this major pulse of woody debris that accumulates on the forest floor. So we might expect trees within landscapes to fall just as quickly. And so this is important if you have a lot of dead ash in your forest, in your landscape, to deal with it before it maybe becomes a safety hazard. We also looked at how ash typically fell. And so sometimes ash will uproot. And so you actually get what's called pit and mound topography that forms within the forest. And so this can be important habitat for wildlife, amphibians. It also can be used as seed beds for plants. But then other times you get snags that will actually break along the bowl. And so you have this standing snag that's left, which also can be habitat for wildlife. And so we wanted to know whether there was a pattern with how ash trees fell. And what we found here, as you can see in this graph, we've got percentage of fallen ash, and we see that the majority of trees, about 65% of trees broke along the bowl rather than uprooted. So more often, you're going to be left with a standing snag in the forest rather than the soil disturbance or the pit and mound topography from an uprooted tree. And so this information is valuable for forest managers that perhaps have ash along trails, along parking lots, high traffic areas, that may need to think about how to deal with these dead ash in their landscapes. There's also been a lot of work done with biological control of EAB. Of course, biological control is a key component of integrated pest management, the efficacy of natural enemies. And there's been a lot of time and money spent in looking for agents, biological control agents for EAB, testing their efficacy, and getting them approved for release within the US. And then developing that program so that these parasitoids can be reared in high numbers and released across the country. And so there are currently 4 parasitoid wasps that are approved for release in North America. In 2007, the first 3 were approved and released. And so there's 1 egg parasitoid, Obius, as you can see here, and 2 larval parasitoids, one of which is shown here, Tetrasticus. And there's been substantial releases throughout Michigan and Ohio, but elsewhere in the eastern United States. And there is evidence that these parasitoids have established, some better than others. Tetrasticus in particular has done fairly well throughout most regions. Obius has also been recovered in many regions, although it's a little bit more difficult to sample for and to detect. And monitoring does continue for these parasitoids. However, there hasn't been strong evidence that these parasitoids can build their populations quick enough to control high-density outbreak EAB populations and thus slow ash mortality, particularly on the leading edge. And then additionally, with variability in establishment success, there's a species that I don't have pictured here, Spathius, that wasn't establishing quite as well in more cold regions. And so there was an additional parasitoid that was approved for release in 2015 that was found to have increased cold tolerance. It was identified from the Russian Far East. And so there is a 4th species that was released more recently, and there's current monitoring that's ongoing to determine its establishment success and impact on EAB. There's also been some native parasitoids that have been found to parasitize EAB. And so I have a picture here. Atanicolus is one of the species that has been detected. So these are mostly generalist parasitoids. And so they've been found to parasitize, EAB when populations are high, so during outbreaks of EAB. However, their parasitism rates have been variable, and it's unclear if they can provide much control at low density EAB populations. And so this work I find to be particularly interesting when thinking about post-outbreak forests, and I'll get into this a little bit more later when I talk about some of the research that I'm hoping to do in my new program. But thinking about the value of biological control agents that are established throughout the eastern US and what effect they might have once EAB populations crash in these post-outbreak forests compared to sort of the lack of impact that they're really having at the leading edge with high EAB population densities. All right, and the last thing I wanted to talk about was resistant or lingering ash. And so you may have heard this term lingering ash, and essentially it's mature native ash trees within the forests that are untreated but remain healthy, particularly when other ash trees are dying around them. And so that's really illustrated here in this photo, where you can see this ash tree that's alive, surrounded by these ash trees that are declining or dead. And so there's varying degrees of natural genetic resistance within ash populations that influence how trees respond to EAB, but also how quickly that they die. And so these lingering ash have been used in resistance breeding programs to investigate this natural resistance and possibly provide additional resistance to ash trees that we may then plant in the future. And so there is a very strong breeding program that is currently ongoing that is using both Asian species, but also some of these lingering ash that have been found in Michigan, Ohio, and elsewhere. And essentially, this could be a really important management tactic moving forward. thinking about low density EAB populations in post-outbreak forests. And so stay tuned there. I'm really excited to see what these programs find over time. Takes a long time to grow a tree from seed and to get it to be the size in which it becomes susceptible to EAB. So these programs take a while, but they have the potential to be very successful. One of the things that I'm hoping to do is to resurvey some of the lingering ash that we identified in some of our Michigan work to see how these are doing. In some cases, lingering ash that have been surveyed over time, they have been found to decline and eventually die. It just happens at a slower rate. But it is very important that we continue to survey these lingering ash to see how they're doing over time to then inform these resistance breeding programs. So much of my research on EAB has focused on ecological impacts of EAB within natural forests. And I've looked at both direct and indirect ecological impacts. And a really important direct impact, of course, is the decline and death of ash trees, genus Fraxinus, within forests. And so when this happens, you essentially get a gap in the forest that can then impact a variety of environmental conditions on the forest floor. So we can see increased light availability reaching the forest floor that we don't see in forests with closed canopies. And this can stimulate understory growth of both native and exotic understory plant species. And it also has the potential to change temperature and moisture regimes on the forest floor, which can impact wildlife. And some of the work that we've done in Michigan in state parks and metro parks have shown that ash mortality happens very quickly at the stand scale. So thinking about these gaps and these impacts in the forest and how it's happening at the stand scale. So of course I mentioned that EAB attacks trees that are at least 1 inch in diameter. So we're talking about a substantial portion of the ash population. So this figure here is showing the percentage of ash mortality on the y-axis and then year here on the x-axis. So remember, EAB was first detected in Michigan near Detroit, which is where these parks are located, in 2002. So this is a few years after we were really starting to see impacts and detect EAB, so 2005. And so ash mortality increased very rapidly in these sites. And then by 2009, mortality was greater than 99% of mature trees within these forests. And really importantly, we saw no new seedlings after 2008. So we don't see much regeneration shortly after this substantial mortality. We're getting these gaps that are being created pretty widely throughout the forest. And so one of the things that our research group was interested in was, well, what might this widespread mortality, what threats might they pose to native herbivore biodiversity? And so this figure, this pie chart here, is looking at arthropod species that utilize ash during some part of their life cycle. So we have low risk species, high risk species, high moderate, and moderate. And you can see the breakdown here. And so we might particularly think about, okay, generalist species. These species are considered low risk because they're not strictly dependent on ash in order to complete their life cycle. Whereas specialists perhaps are considered high risk because they require ash in order to complete their life cycle, survive. And if we look at the species of high risk specialists, they're quite diverse. So this includes species of mites, which is like acari, butterflies and moths and Lepidoptera, true bugs and Hemiptera, flies and Diptera, Coleoptera, which are beetles, and of course my favorite group, and then beetles, ants, and wasps, and Hymenoptera. And if we think about what might happen if we lose these high-risk specialist species as ash trees die, this could have potentially cascading indirect effects on other trophic levels, right? Predators and parasitoids that may feed on or use these specialist species during their life cycle. And so one of the questions that we had was, can non-native ash species support native arthropod biodiversity? So if we're seeing native North American ash species decline due to EAB, could non-native ash potentially support these specialists? As we know, of course, native green and black ash are highly susceptible to EAB. They have no innate resistance, whereas Asian Manchurian ash shares a coevolutionary history with EAB. And so there is resistance within Manchurian ash, and EAB typically colonizes and kills only stressed Manchurian ash trees. And so that's really shown here in this figure. So this was a common garden experiment conducted in Michigan, established in 2004. And so here you're seeing percentage survival on the y-axis. And then here we're looking at 2009, 2011, and 2012. And this is tracking percentage survival of green ash and black ash in circles and triangles, and then Manchurian ash in the squares. And so you can see by 2009, the native North American green and black ash had already had very low survival within this common garden experiment, which declined after that. Whereas Manchurian ash maintained high survival over time within this common garden experiment. So again, sharing this coevolutionary history with EAB, there is resistance there, and therefore those trees are able to survive. And so, will native species, arthropod species, these specialists, use Manchurian ash as a host? Well, if we look in the literature, there's some mixed results that might, inform this hypothesis, but there's evidence that, maybe non-native plants are not preferred by native generalists, that native plant species are superior hosts for specialist arthropods, and so there might be limited ability to support native communities and the arthropod specialists, the herbivores, but also higher trophic levels, the parasitoids and the pathogens. And so, well, what about hybrid ash? So maybe if the non-native Manchurian ash isn't a great host, what about a hybrid North American and Asian ash? And in fact, there is a horticultural cultivar that is available, the Northern Treasure hybrid, which is black ash and Manchurian hybrid. This is available. And here you can see this Northern Treasure cultivar was part of this common garden experiment. And here it's shown in the diamonds. And this hybrid was able to maintain high survival throughout this experiment, very similar to Manchurian ash. Okay, so we see that this hybrid is capable of surviving under high pressure from EAB, but will specialist arthropods adopt this hybrid as a host? This isn't a new idea, actually. It has a name. It's called the hybrid bridge hypothesis. And so this is essentially the idea that plant hybridization facilitates host shifting by specialist herbivores. And some studies that have primarily focused on native tree species that naturally hybridize in the field, they found that hybrids actually support greater herbivore diversity than either parent species. And so some of this work has been done with eucalyptus species and populus species. However, this focus on a hybrid between a native and an exotic that do not naturally co-occur is a more novel application of this hypothesis. And, we really wanted to know whether hybrid ash could support ash specialists, particularly as ash mortality continues throughout the country. It's perhaps important to understand the ecological value of non-native and hybrid ash for supporting native biodiversity in this capacity. And so to look at this, we conducted another common garden experiment. And so this experiment is present on the Ohio State Worcester campus. This is an old picture, but the trees are a bit bigger now. But essentially, we have a variety of different ash species or ash taxa within this common garden. And for this experiment, we looked at 4. So we looked at green ash and black ash, 2 of our native North American species. We looked at the Asian Manchurian ash, and then we also looked at the black by Manchurian ash hybrid, Northern Treasure. And so here, this is just a little diagram of what the Common Garden experiment looks like. It was established in 2011. I helped plant many of these trees, and it's great to see them grow. But essentially, we've got 5 different blocks, and you can sort of see how the trees are positioned throughout those blocks. We randomly selected these trees for this experiment. And so at the time, this project was done in 2016, and we were trapping EAB within the Common Garden, and it was the insect was present at low levels, but the trees that were selected for this experiment had no major signs or symptoms of EAB infestation, and there was no significant evidence of a canopy decline. And then we sampled these trees for herbivores, and we particularly focused on beetles because we had to make a decision about what taxa to investigate here, focusing on specialists. Remember, there's that long list of different arthropod taxa that include ash specialists, and within our research team, we had beetle expertise. So we decided to look at herbivorous beetles, and we sampled the canopy and the bark. So one way that we sampled the canopy was spraying it with insecticide. You can see here how that occurred. And then we put this, this tarp below the trees, as you can see here, sprayed the trees, waited a few minutes, and then as arthropods fell from the tree, they were collected and brought back to the lab for identification. We also collected herbivorous beetles on the bark. And so we used these wraps, as you can see here. We tied them around the bark of the tree, and then we used some adhesive, sticky material. So as beetles and other insects were walking along the bark of the trees, they got stuck in this, and we removed them from the bark in the lab, or from the bark wraps, excuse me, in the lab, and then identified them to species. And so we did this project for 1 year, and we found almost 2,000 beetles, of which about 576 were herbivores. And so the majority of that 1,944 beetles were actually predators or fungivores. So only a subset were herbivores. And of that 576 individuals that we collected that were beetles, we found 82 species, which is quite a lot. The most abundant groups in terms of species richness were weevils. That's family Curculionidae. We found 22 different species of weevils, and then leaf beetles, which is family Chrysomelidae, 21 different species. Well, what about the ash specialists? Well, we only found 4 beetle ash specialist species. Those are listed and pictured here. We also found them in very low abundance, so a little more than 30 total individuals out of this 576 were ash specialists. So we found the eastern ash bark beetle, we found a leaf beetle, and we found 2 ash seed weevils here. So we did, find a few ash specialist species. We found them in low abundance, so they were fairly rare within the Common Garden. However, we did collect at least one of each of these individuals on the hybrid and Manchurian ash. In addition to these 4 native ash specialist species, we also found 15 non-native species of beetles, herbivores, like Japanese beetle, for example, that were present on these trees. And so some of the things that we looked at, I'll share some of the results with you today. This paper is published, so if you're interested and want to know more, I'd be happy to share it with you. But we wanted to know how species richness of native herbivorous beetles varied among the different ash taxa that we sampled. And so this figure here is looking at species richness on the y-axis as a function of the number of individuals that we collected. And we have the black by Manchurian hybrid shown in yellow. We've got Manchurian ash shown in blue, black ash in this dark purple, and then green ash shown here in green. And so we found that green ash hosted the most beetle species, particularly in the canopy, which is what the data that I'm showing right now. However, the hybrid and Manchurian ash hosted slightly less, but more than black ash. So still fairly consistent within the number of species that we're finding, and not necessarily, much fewer species found in these canopies. However, as I mentioned, we did see that ash specialists were rare within the common garden. And in fact, we only collected 4 of the 14 ash specialist beetles that occur within the region. But they were found on hybrid and non-native ash. So although this isn't a lot of data to work with, potentially this is promising and definitely, suggests that we maybe should look at this in more depth. And I would particularly recommend on the leading edge of the AB distribution. I also looked at beetle species composition. So we wanted to know whether the community of native herbivorous beetles on these ash taxa differed substantially. And so that's what this figure here is showing. So this is non-metric multidimensional scaling analysis. I do these frequently. You'll see a few more before the end of this talk. But essentially, you can ignore these numbers here along the X and Y axis. They're not important. What you need to look at is the distribution of points within what we call species space here. And again, we're focusing on the canopy. So each one of these points here is a community of beetles on a particular ash taxa. And so again, we've got the hybrid shown in yellow, Manchurian ash in blue, black ash in the dark purple, and then green ash in green. And so how you want to interpret this figure is points that are closer together. So thinking, here where we see Manchurian ash and black ash almost overlapping. These points that are very close to each other, that means they have very similar composition. So the beetle species, the community that was collected on this Manchurian ash and this black ash tree were very similar. These points are almost overlapping. Points that are further away from each other, such as this green ash up here and this green ash tree down here, that suggests that the beetle communities found on those trees are more different. So think about these, each one of these points being a tree and species space. And so essentially what we found was that there was high variability among trees within a taxa. And so that's what these ellipses are showing. It's the 90% confidence interval. So we can see, among green ash trees, there is some variability in the beetles that were found on that tree, or found on those trees, excuse me. But generally, all of these points are fairly overlapping. And so that suggests that the composition of herbivorous beetles on these trees is overall very similar. And this is probably not super surprising considering we found very few specialists and the herbivorous native beetles were dominated by generalist species. And so overall, we see that the communities are fairly similar and they're utilizing these trees fairly equally due to their generalist host specificity. And so some of the main takeaways from this research is cautioning that perhaps post-outbreak forests, so areas that have experienced substantial ash mortality over time, so this is in 2016, it had been 10 or more years since this region had been experiencing ash mortality, it's possible that they're no longer supporting ash specialists. Perhaps ash specialist populations are not stable within these regions, which could be a problem in terms of biodiversity conservation. And so some recommendations we might have is to preemptively plant hybrid or non-native ash before widespread ash mortality occurs. If specialists are going to utilize these species, it would be really beneficial to preemptively plant them so that they're able to do this before their populations drop. And as I mentioned earlier, we might want to prioritize this management approach at the leading edge of expanding EAB populations. And although we didn't collect many specialists, I'm saying this with caution, and I think there's room for additional research, but potential for specialists to utilize hybrid and non-native ash. There are some caveats with this research that I wanted to point out. So as you're thinking about these results that I presented, we did only focus on beetles. So there are multiple arthropod taxa that include specialist species for ash. We focused on beetles for logistical purposes and also our strengths of the research team. Additionally, these trees were fairly small. And so if there's any sort of preference with ash specialists in terms of the age of the trees that they use, that may also explain why either we collected fewer ash specialist individuals or species, or why that may have explained the results that we got here in this study. Ash mortality also results in indirect ecological impacts. As I mentioned, canopy gap formation is a big one. Changing light regimes on the forest floor, altering growth of understory vegetation, potentially changing temperature and moisture regimes on the forest floor. And we can see here, I have some data showing that canopy gaps do indeed increase light availability on the forest floor from ash mortality. So this figure here is looking at percentage canopy openness on the y-axis, and then we have data collected within a gap underneath a dead ash tree compared to nearby closed canopy forests. And so substantially more light reaching the forest floor within these environments caused by ash mortality. And, why does this matter as an indirect impact? Trees die in the forest, light gaps are created all the time when a tree dies, doesn't have to be an ash. So, why does it matter in this case? And it really becomes important when you're thinking about the scale at which this is happening. And so depending upon the ash density within a particular forest stand, gap formation can be widespread, and it can also be relatively simultaneous. And so if you look at this picture here on the left, this really sort of hits this point home, where if you can create potentially very large gaps where you have multiple ash next to each other and they all die fairly simultaneously, and you have gaps that are being created throughout the forest, which is a very different process than natural tree death that we might see for within our forests. And in particular, I like to think about indirect impacts of ash mortality sort of changing over time. So there's these progression of forest changes that occur following ash mortality. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how I've quantified some of those changes and their impacts on wildlife. So one way that I've used to assess forest health is measures of biodiversity, and particularly I focused on arthropods as indicators of environmental change. And I've looked a lot at ground and soil dwelling arthropods in particular for a variety of reasons. So arthropods in general respond quickly to changes in habitat quality. So they're often considered pretty good indicators of environmental or structural change within habitats, including forests. And arthropods are also really great food resources for vertebrate species. So thinking about ground and soil dwelling arthropods, birds, amphibians, small mammals, as well as other invertebrates, millipedes, and centipedes. Centipedes in particular will feed on other soft-bodied arthropods. And additionally, thinking about ground and soil dwelling arthropods and this community that's living on the forest floor, they encompass diverse functional guilds, and they contribute to a variety of different ecosystem services. So I've looked a lot at predators, which contribute to pest suppression, as well as decomposers and fungivores. So they're regulating decomposition and nutrient cycling on the forest floor. Some other arthropods can be considered ecosystem engineers. So ants are a great example, altering soil structure and contributing to seed dispersal. And then of course, even though I haven't studied them in a lot of detail, I'm not going to talk about them today, we also have to remember that pollinators use forests as habitat, and they contribute to pollination services within forests. And particularly, there's some evidence that queen bumblebees might be using forests, particularly in the spring when they're starting their colonies. And so there's a lot of attention on habitat quality of forests for a variety of different arthropods and the ecosystem services that they provide. And so some of the research that I have done has been looking at the different indirect impacts of ash mortality on arthropods. And so, and particularly, as I mentioned, tracking these changes and impacts over time. And so initially when EAB colonizes ash trees within a particular stand and kills the trees, you get these very large canopy gaps. You can see that here from this picture. And so I had the opportunity to sample arthropods at Plumbrook Research Station, which is a NASA research station near Sandusky, and look at some of the responses of soil and ground dwelling arthropods to these canopy gaps. And one of the groups that I focus on were ground beetles. And here this figure is showing particular responses of Cyclotrachylus convivus, which is a species of ground beetle that is found commonly in forests. So the y-axis here is showing you the abundance of beetles per trap within my forest sites, particularly whether that site had a canopy gap from ash mortality, or if it was a nearby closed canopy site. And so some of the patterns that I was finding, and it's illustrated really well by Cyclotrachylus convivus, is that we were seeing forest species in lower abundance in canopy gaps compared to closed canopy sites. And if you're thinking about the scale at which gap formation is occurring in forests, that has the potential to really change the behavior and the activity patterns of forest specialists that may not be utilizing these canopy gap environments for either habitat or food resources. And if we take a step back and we look at community composition of ground beetles, so this particular family of beetles that I specialize in, here's another community composition plot here. So remember each one of these points, this is a site, and it's represented in species space. So we can look at different ground beetle species that we find in these different sites. So the triangles are canopy gaps, the circles are closed canopy. And interestingly, I found a shift in species composition. And what that's really representing is we're seeing decreases in these forest species like Cyclotrachylus convivus in canopy gaps, and we're actually seeing open habitat and generalist ground beetles, such as this Poecillus species shown here, that are coming into these gaps and utilizing these resources where they're not really found in closed canopy contiguous forest. And so we have species that are utilizing these gaps, even if they're not forest species. And so this is potentially changing the species composition that we're finding in forest stands. And at a landscape scale, it might actually be increasing diversity within the region. I looked at more than just ground beetles. So I did look at soil and ground dwelling arthropod communities more broadly. And we see similar patterns that we do for forest ground beetle species. And we're actually seeing a decrease in the diversity of arthropods within canopy gaps. And so this change in resources that's associated with gaps is affecting more than just one or two species. It's affecting multiple families of arthropods. So here's Cyclotrachylus again, but we also saw decreases in different families of Collembola, which graze on bacteria and fungi, in dung beetles. And this is a camel cricket, so these are herbivores, and then a harvestman. So a variety of different guilds of arthropods are responding to canopy gaps within these forests. And then over time, we see that as gaps begin to close, so as the surrounding trees within the forest respond to this increase in light, and increase in resources, and they grow to fill these gaps, that's about the time when we see ash trees falling to the forest floor, right? So they're snapping along the bole, or they're uprooting. And we see this big pulse of ash logs and branches, also known as ash coarse woody debris, that falls to the forest floor. And logs and branches in forests are really important habitat for wildlife. They're a fundamental structural component. They're often referred to as biological legacies, but essentially they provide food, they provide habitat for vertebrates, for invertebrates, for sites, they also provide sites for breeding and overwintering for insects and vertebrates and also plants. And so I also wanted to know how this pulse of ash coarse woody debris, knowing that it's this fundamental structural component in forests, is affecting arthropod communities over time. And so it could take years and years for this pulse of wood on the forest floor to decompose. And so this is sort of a long-term component that will affect forests from ash mortality. Oops, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. And so to do this, I sampled arthropods along an ash woody debris decay chronosequence. And so essentially I found ash logs that had recently fallen and had minimal signs of decay. We're calling this class 1. I found ash logs that were beginning to decay. And so we found, bark cracking, so creating more habitat. As the bark cracks, arthropods are able to colonize these habitats, some moss colonization, and then lastly, more decayed logs, but still able to be identified as ash. So we couldn't actually follow through the entire sort of decomposition class, which has a 4 and a 5, but those really lose structural integrity and you really can't tell what species it is anymore. So, focusing on this 1, 2, and 3 class decomposition scale. And so here, class 3 logs had lost almost all of their bark. There was signs of moss and fungi colonization. So you can sort of see those 3 classes represented in these pictures here. And then I also sampled away from woody debris to see how that could potentially impact what species we were collecting. And so we can get a better idea if there's just some effect of woody debris just in general, regardless of the decomposition stage in which it's in. So I looked at arthropod community composition. You should be really great at interpreting these figures now at this point in the talk. But essentially, again, each one of these dots is a trap that is either next to a class 1 log, which is shown in the circles, a class 2 log, which is a triangle, class 3 log, which is a square, and then also those traps by no ash woody debris that's represented by the X here. And so we can take a look at the composition of arthropods collected sort of across this decay chronosequence. And so first, I wanted to compare class 1. So remember, these are the logs with minimal decay to class 3, which are the logs that are experiencing more decay. And what we can see here is that there is difference in arthropod community composition among recently fallen as well as more decayed logs. So we see this separation in points in species space, which signifies a difference in arthropod community composition. However, if we look at decay class 2, which is in the middle, we're seeing some signs of decay, but not this more advanced stages of decay. Here we see these overlapping quite substantially with decay class 1 and decay class 3. And so this is really exemplifying sort of this succession of arthropod community composition, or the species that are utilizing this woody debris resource over time, and how we're seeing sort of a glimpse in the middle of this shift in composition that's occurring, which is really cool. And then, of course, you see the X's are all over the place in this figure. So we're collecting species that are similar to communities next to these logs, also very different. And so it's likely perhaps a site-specific effect that we're seeing with that, but generally very different community composition among sites without wood. And so this really suggests that this pulse of woody debris accumulation that's occurring from ash mortality can have long-term impacts on ground-dwelling arthropod community structure and composition within forests, and this likely cascades to other groups such as amphibians and small mammals. And this research has also really shown how there's this change in resources associated over time with woody decay progression that can then affect fauna within forests. And so some main take-home messages from my work looking at ecological impacts over time is we can detect indirect impacts of ash mortality from emerald ash borer in forests, and we can also detect how these impacts change over time. So thinking about the legacies that are created by emerald ash borer induced ash mortality, particularly this pulse of woody debris accumulation that occurs, it has the potential to impact forest structure and arthropod communities for a long time. So initially we see canopy gaps are an important driver, community structure soon after tree death. And then of course, ash woody debris becomes an important driver of community structure once those snags fall to the forest floor. So again, potential for long-term impacts of invasive insects, such as EAB on forest structure and communities, beyond those direct impacts on ash mortality itself, or ash trees and ash populations within forests. All right, so lastly, I just wanted to wrap up and talk a little bit about one of the big questions that I feel is still unanswered in terms of impacts of ash and emerald ash borer on forest communities, and sort of the future and persistence of ash within post-outbreak forests. And really, will ash survive in post-outbreak forests? And particularly thinking about how there's potential for them to survive with low density EAB populations and a history of biological control releases. And so one of the things that we've observed with our research in Ohio and in Michigan is that although many of the mature ash trees, 99% or more, are dead within the forest canopy, ash is actually really abundant in the understory as seedlings and saplings. And this group of ash has been termed the orphan cohort of ash, right? Their parents are dead, but they're alive in the understory, and they're growing over time and will become, and many have become, susceptible to EAB, that 1-inch diameter size class. And so as we see many mature ash within these forests die, the hosts are removed, EAB populations crash, I think a major question is, will these parasitoids that have been broadly released and in many cases have established in these forests, will they become more effective at controlling low density EAB populations? This is a question that many researchers have been asking for a while now. But I think in post-outbreak forests, we've gotten to the point where we might actually be able to test this question now. And so I'm hoping this summer and within the next couple of years to revisit some of those sites that I showed data on today, where we have sampled the forest community, we've sampled arthropods, we've sampled understory plants. We have this existing data set that's about 10 years worth of data, revisit those sites and see how forest communities have changed following ash loss, but then also what's happening with the orphan cohort of ash. Are they dying? Are they abundant? What's the status of the orphan cohort? And then also, are parasitoids keeping EAB populations under some threshold that allows this orphan cohort to survive into the future? So I think that's an area that needs further research, and I'm hoping to tackle some of these questions with my new research program. So thank you all so much for listening to this presentation. I've really enjoyed talking about this work, sharing it with you all today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability.
Okay, thank you, Kayla.
That was awesome.
Yeah, awesome presentation. Depressing in some aspects, but awesome.
I tried to end on a high note.
You did. I was like, is she going to answer that question? Oh,
yeah.
But future webinar topic.
Yeah.
It is tough sometimes when you're talking invasive species to be positive.
Yeah, I know.
But you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Marnie, I still don't have a camera.
Okay.
So I'm going to let you
A lot of people.
dive in.
Work my way through the questions. Okay, we got a lot of questions. I'm just going to start from the top, and hopefully we'll get through all of them. So Bob asks, and I think he put this in even before you started talking, so he really yes. Can my sapling ash trees in Southeast Ohio reach maturity?
That's a great question. It depends. So maybe, if you're planning to treat those trees as they grow and become, susceptible to EAB, then yes, they probably can. And perhaps if, we find that the biological control agents are working, more effectively with low density AB populations. You know, who knows? I'm going to stay hopeful, but also cautious. So we'll see.
Well, good. Carolyn is asking, will EAB die out once ash and white fringe trees are gone?
So what we're seeing is that it's still present. So even though we've lost much of the host trees within post-outbreak forests, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, it's still present. So you still need to treat. It's unclear whether we're unlikely to lose every tree. But you know, EAB is here for a really long time. I guess we'll find out. But I wouldn't anticipate that happening anytime soon, especially since we're seeing young ash continually entering, you know, the susceptible size class. And we know that young ash is really abundant in these forests.
Great. Okay, Stephanie is asking, once an area forest with ash trees has been deforested / devastated, can it be reforested with young ash trees relatively safely?
Reforested as in, you know, targeted plantings of ash, or reforested as in, you know, the young ash that are present will grow and survive. I guess I would say we probably have, I would hypothesize that we would have more success with ash trees that are already present in the understory. You know, there are a lot of things that you have to consider if you're going in and restoring and you're planting ash. It's not that it's impossible, but you have to think about ways in which you know, you can ensure that those young ash will survive following that planting, and also be competitive. So, you know, there's high competition in forest understories. But of course, you know, planting ash within landscapes is also an option. Thinking about your yard or other parks. And I also think it might be worth planting, as I mentioned, non-native and hybrid ash. I think there is value, there's potential, you know, for those alternative species to be important. And we also see, you know, variability in susceptibility among ash species to EAB. So for example, when I started this position in August, one of the first things I did was went out to the common garden that I talked about that's on the Worcester campus. And I inventoried a lot of the trees, particularly the trees, you know, from that experiment that I talked about. We've got green ash, we've got main ash, we have black ash. Black ash is mostly dead, but the blue ash actually look beautiful. They have very few signs and symptoms of EAB damage, and their canopies just beautiful.
Interesting.
I can describe. So, you know,
yeah,
I don't know.
Cool. So lots of crystal ball questions here. There's another one.
I know,
What
yeah.
species will likely replace ash trees in heavily impacted stands?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So that's one of the questions I'm hoping to answer by resampling some of those long-term sites where, you know, we have data on the progression of ash mortality. We have data on the trees that existed when ash died, and then seeing sort of which trees took off. But the hypothesis is that maples will do really well by replacing ash. We found that in some cases. But yeah, that's a question I'm hoping to answer in these post-outbreak forests.
Right. Kevin asks, what is the impact of the insecticides on native ash-dependent insects? And can native insects feed on the leaves?
That's a good question. So there has been some work looking at sort of the indirect impacts of insecticide treatment on native insects. And they haven't necessarily detected strong impacts for a couple of reasons. One, ash is wind pollinated, and so you don't necessarily have the impacts on pollinators that you do with some of these other species of trees, and you know, these big pollinator die-offs that have been in the news. But also the scale at which, you know, you're treating ash trees with insecticide, you know, you can't do that at a forest scale, and so they're just high value trees in landscapes and, you know, in folks' yards like that. That's not going to have a great impact native insect populations, just due to the sheer number of trees that we're able to treat.
Okay. I think the next question is very much related, specifically asking about imidacloprid and you know,
Yeah.
is it better to what are the offset? Is it better to treat using that, or are there more negative impacts on those native insects as well?
Yeah, my suggestion is to treat. Like I said, we can't treat trees on the scale at which you know, we would start to see those negative impacts on native insect populations. It's just not logistically feasible. And so, you know, go ahead and treat your tree to save it, essentially, because that's what you have to do.
Yeah. So a question on the parasitoid wasp, which I just think are fascinating. So Sandra's wondering, has the introduction of these non-native parasitoid wasps had a negative impact on other insect larvae?
That is a very good question. And I have not seen any evidence that that is occurring, at least on a great enough scale, you know, to impact native insects. So in order for classical biological control agents, so, you know, researchers went to Asia, they identified these parasitoid species within the field, and before they get approval to be released in North America, they have to go through rigorous processes where they do host testing. And so, you know, there are steps in place to minimize the impact of these parasitoids on other insect larvae. And so there were tests that were done, and they successfully passed these tests, and they were found to have, you know, very specific host specificity on EAB, which gave them the green light to be reared and introduced broadly throughout, you know, North America.
Yeah, and it's crazy how specific they can be too.
Yeah.
On their hosts. It's really, again, fascinating. Denise says that she has some European ash and they seem to be undamaged. She's asking if they're more resistant, or did they just get lucky?
Well, from what I've seen, European ash is susceptible. So it's possible that you just got lucky, but I am not sure the data on looking at, you know, different European species, and if there is variability in resistance. That's not you know, I'm not necessarily familiar with that, but my understanding is European species are also susceptible to EAB. Yeah.
All right, next question. Jordan's asking, what diameter / age do ashes typically begin to produce seed?
So it can vary a little bit, but, you know, there are some data that suggests, you know, as young as 8 to 10 years. And this can be influenced by a variety of different factors, including sort of the stress that tree is experiencing. But generally speaking, you know, they're well into the susceptible size class for, you know, EAB attack by the time that they're producing seed. So, you know, getting ash trees to maturity, you know, letting them grow so that they can produce seed is really critical if we want to preserve ash within natural forests. And I'm really hoping that we can see these parasitoids have a greater effect in order to help us do that, you know, maintain ash persistence in forests.
Right. Joel says, is there any kind of data / research showing how many lingering ash may be out there?
That's a good question. I'm sure someone has those data. It's not me. I know the Forest Service had an outreach program at one point in time, maybe that's still going on, where they were trying to get the word out to the public and having the public report ash trees that are still alive in their yard or in, you know, parks that they frequent, so that they could get them on a list of lingering ash and potentially be used in these breeding programs. But I am not sure if, you know, how extensive this list might be, what states, you know, they have data for. That would be a question for, you know, someone in the Forest Service perhaps to provide that answer.
Have any updates on that? I know you work with Kathleen here and there.
Yeah, so it would be Kathleen or Jennifer Cook. that have asked, and we've put that stuff in the Woodland Stewards newsletter before when they're looking for those kind of things. So
Yep.
I think they still are looking and wanting folks to report, because I know I've had, a couple people email me that they have live ash, and I send them to Kathleen and the info so that they have it. But I've never seen a list, but I assume that they have one that they work from.
Yep. Yeah, and we do have some of the, from the breeding program that, they're involved with. Some of those trees are on the Worcester campus in that common garden that I talked about. So I'm really excited to see, how those trees do over time. Some of them look good and some of them, look not so good, but.
Well, and we have an outplanting at the OSU Mansfield campus that was put in a little over a year ago. So it's going to be interesting to follow those as well, to see how they do, what kind of replications they had. They may plant more out, but what we've got so far, it's been interesting to follow. And they put traps out, and we know we still have EAB because we find them on the traps. So
same. Yep. They put a trap out here as well. Every year. EAB still finds it, and they're stuck to it.
All right. Sandy's asking, how do the Manchurian ash fare with our native ash borers?
That's a good question. I do not know the answer to that. I have not looked at or read any papers about that. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Rick is well, he said he lives in Fulton County and his adult ash trees have been smoked by EAB. Sorry, Rick. He has many small ash trees now growing back, and he's wondering if it's safe to treat these young ash trees at the same time not hurting his black walnut and oak trees that are in the mixed forest.
Yeah, so if they're getting to the size class in which they're susceptible to EAB, you could consider doing a soil treatment is probably how I would approach it. There's a calculation for the size of the tree and how much insecticide you have to use for that tree. And so if they're small, you probably save some money. You wouldn't have to apply as much. But think about maybe doing that this spring if you're interested, and if they're susceptible. Yeah.
Thanks. Anne was asking about the garden. I believe that was your research in Worcester that you were referring to. So
yep. So I talked about one common garden that's on the Ohio State Worcester campus. It's been referred to as like the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center in the past, or the Worcester OSU campus. It's right near Seacrest Arboretum, which is open to the public. Many people walk by the garden all the time as they're walking their dogs around Seacrest. And I also presented some data from a common garden that was in Michigan. That's not necessarily a project that I was involved with, but yeah, so two common gardens. I can see how that could be used.
Okay, Glenn's asking, once the ash tree dies, do the remaining larvae in the tree die off immediately, or do they continue their life cycle to completion?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So no, not necessarily. And it also depends on what life stage, where the larvae are at in their development. But remember, it's hypothesized that EAB was introduced into North America in wood packing material, right? And so it is very possible that if you are moving around ash firewood, so trees that have been cut, you're still able to spread, like EAB is still able to emerge, and you're able to spread the beetle. And that's actually hypothesized that that's how that Colorado, I showed the map of the current distribution of EAB. And so there's that point in Colorado, and that introduction happens to be like around a camping area. And so it's hypothesized that people brought in infested ash firewood to that campsite. And then now it's in Colorado.
So I just want to get to this one before I miss it. Kevin asked earlier the question about the impact of insecticides on native ash dependent insects. And he wanted to add on that he was really wondering if native ash dependent insects can feed on the leaves of the treated trees. Specifically, does the metozoan, sorry, I'm not pronouncing that right,
Mm-hmm.
benzoate,
Mhm.
does it impact what is feeding under the bark, or does it impact the leaves as well?
Mhm. It would impact the leaves as well, yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
great, thank you for
It's
clarifying.
systemic, yep.
We have a question about hybrid studies done on white ash.
Mhm. So we didn't include that in our experiment, but there are white ash hybrids that are included in like the USDA like breeding program. So we just didn't include that in our study, but white ash hybrids are being tested. So we'll see what happens, I guess.
Yep. Fred is asking, do you not think that ash specialists will take advantage of many young seedling ash trees in woodlands post-outbreak? He says some of the woodlands in Northeast Ohio are carpeted with ash seedlings less than 2 foot tall.
Yes, they are, which is super exciting.
Yeah.
That there are so many ash seedlings and saplings. It is possible that ash specialists will take advantage of young saplings. I guess there are just some nuanced questions there. So, if we're talking about really small trees, like, is there enough, food resources for those specialist species to develop? So if we're talking about like Lepidoptera, like caterpillars eat a lot of food before they become an adult. And so is there enough for, food to sustain a population? I don't know. For the ash seed weevils, they use ash seeds. And so if we're only talking about young ash that haven't reproduced, we're really missing a resource that some of these specialists need. So I think it's more of a nuanced question. There's also, like I said, potentially some preferences of ash specialists for different life stages of ash trees. So we may see that some are able to use young ash and some aren't.
Yeah, interesting. Lisa asks, what research has been done on the potential impact of introducing a non-native ash tree into North American forests? Will it become another invasive species?
That's a good question. Something we should all be cognizant about. I don't know if anyone's looked at introducing like Manchurian ash and its effects on like a forested habitat. I think that it's more plausible perhaps that non-native or hybrid ash could be targeted for plantings in like urban areas. So thinking about diversifying urban forests or landscape trees. I don't necessarily see a strong application of introducing Manchurian or hybrid ash into like forested settings. So I'm hoping, but that's not to say that a tree that's planted in a landscape setting isn't necessarily going to escape and become invasive within a forested setting. We've seen that happen many times.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone's necessarily looked at those impacts in particular that I'm aware of.
Sandra's asking, where are the hybrid ash available for residential lots? Maybe asking where she can get those?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I guess.
I don't know if they're sold.
Yeah.
When we hit the nursery level of not selling ash, I can't say that I've seen any of the hybrids in a nursery listing since then.
So that Northern Treasure hybrid, so we have that in the Common Garden on the Worcester campus. It looks great still. But that was a horticultural, cultivar before, like that existed before EAB was even introduced. So I would think that, that would be around, but I really have no idea where you would get it. It's a great question. Something I should look into.
All right, John is asking, the aphis parasitoid release program has been around for some time. I've just recently heard about it and quickly signed up our forest to participate. Even now, it seems there are relatively few program participants in Ohio. Why hasn't Ohio promoted the program more aggressively?
I don't know why specifically. It's really easy to do, right? You just sign up and they send you the parasitoids and you put them out and they just, I don't know exactly. I know that there are places around Ohio that have released them. They've been widely distributed in Michigan. I've been to the rearing facility. It's very cool. But I think it is important that, we get these parasitoids released, allow them to get their populations built up. And, if they're going to have any potential impact on low density AB populations, like we need to make sure they're out there so that they can do so. Yeah, it's great to hear that you're participating in the program.
Okay. There's a question about, is there a tree species taking over? I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, so maybe you could specify that question. For now, we'll move on to the next. If you find orphaned ash on your property, how can you help them survive, and at what point you give them that help?
Yeah. Keep an eye on it, right? So look for any signs and symptoms of EAB. Keep track of how large it is. Once it gets to be 1 inch or more in diameter, you could potentially treat the tree because it's becoming susceptible. The best thing is to just monitor it and then go from there. And if you have some on your property, that's really exciting. Try and keep them alive.
Take care of your baby ash.
Yeah.
All right, Ryan's asking about riparian ecosystems. Was most of your research across upland and riparian systems, or only upland? And do you have any insight about impacts and recommendations specific to riparian areas?
That's a good question. So the research that I presented towards the end on the indirect impacts, those from those long-term Michigan forest plots, that experiment is set up across riparian to upland sites. And so typically, in more wet habitats, you find black ash, and then you have riparian habitats, which are primarily dominated by green ash, and then upland habitats by white ash. And so because I was doing pitfall trapping, I avoided the black ash wetland type habitats because my traps would flood. So mostly, the green and white ash communities is where I worked. And so, we're seeing that black ash tends to be a little bit more susceptible. It dies a little bit faster than green or white. But generally speaking, we're seeing high ash mortality across all of those systems. In terms of like treating trees, if you're close to a riparian system, there are some things you need to think about in terms of insecticide application, whether that's going to be leaching into streams. But yeah, we're seeing really major impacts across all sort of ash habitats. There isn't necessarily one that's doing better than the other. One thing I will say, though, is that black ash wetlands, those are sort of a little bit ecologically different because black ash can be a foundation species, whereas green and white aren't necessarily, it's considered foundation species. Sometimes you can find black ash wetlands that are just all black ash, right? And so the impact for these systems has the potential to be a little bit greater because you lose so many trees, and then you have this unique hydrology that's occurring. Like usually when you lose trees, that increases soil moisture because the trees aren't there, taking up moisture. And then that can be even more substantial in wetland systems. And so then that can affect like what species are then able to colonize and survive, those wetland habitats. So I know there's some folks, in maybe Minnesota, like where there are a lot, or Wisconsin, where there are a lot of black ash wetlands up north that haven't quite been substantially impacted by EAB yet because of the northern range of EAB, that have been looking at ways of using like silvicultural treatments to perhaps preemptively plan for EAB taking these really unique wetland habitats. And there's been some work looking at indirect impacts on like vertebrate populations within these sites. So people are working on it.
I believe we've answered this next question, but we've had a lot. So if not, sorry.
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
Stephanie's
This is exciting.
Yeah, about as you are probably realizing, sometimes the Q&A session is just as good as the presentation because people just ask great questions. So Stephanie's asking about the impact of these parasitoids on native Agrilus species or other buprestids. I think those are just boring beetles or native.
Yep.
So I do believe we answered that already. If
Yeah,
not,
the parasitoids go through extensive, testing
The
before
testing,
they're
right.
released, but that isn't to say that they haven't. There isn't one parasitoid out there that has parasitized a native species, but it's not happening. At least that I've data that I've seen. I haven't heard anything that it's becoming a problem.
thanks. Anne is saying that she has her ash trees, she's having them treated, and she's wondering if she can at the same time release parasitory wasps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of two treatment methods.
Yeah,
At the
this
same time.
IPM approach there.
Yep. And then go ahead.
Where are they available?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a USDA lab in Brighton, Michigan, that does the rearing. They've gotten really great at the science of rearing these parasitoids, and they release hundreds of thousands every year. So I would contact them. There is a process of requesting parasitoid wasps. I'm not off the top of my head, I'm not sure exactly what that's called, or if there's a website. Maybe we can find that and put it in the chat, or put it in the the comments of the
program that John was referring to, the parasitoid
I did
release.
find a fact sheet from APHIS, but on it talks about if you're a public landowner or land manager in an area where EAB is infesting ash trees, and then it's got an email you can send information about your property where you'd like to release the wasps. And so I can put that email in the chat. Or I'll tell you what, I'll just put the link to the fact sheet.
Oh, thanks, Mary.
Mary's got it. She's on it. Mary, perfect.
Okay. Faster than I am.
Mary has probably got some insider info on the status of the breeding program. I don't know if she wants to share any details with us.
Mary, if you want to, just let me know in the chat, and I will I'll upgrade your status.
No pressure.
No pressure.
I'm just okay. Yeah.
She says you got it covered.
Awesome.
All right. Fred is saying that he is seeing a number of young ash trees in Northeast Ohio that appear unaffected with DBH of over 2 to 3 inches. None of these trees have been treated. Thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. Like, it's possible that they've escaped EAB. What's the EAB populations within the region? Are parasitoids having an effect? These are all questions that I'm hoping to maybe tackle. And hopefully I'll have some more information soon, but keep checking them. Keep an eye on their health.
We promise all we'll have Kayla back again. So
yeah, I'd love to tell you all about what I found.
Well, and Amy just put in the chat as well, another biocontrol resource. We got a lot of support out there, Kayla.
I know, I work with a great team of people.
Excellent. All right. Claire's saying asking how much study has been done on how treating the ash trees might affect the insects that use that. Okay, we kind of talked about that. So again, kind of looking at lots of concern for the insects. That's so good. That's really good to see. Chuck is asking, will EAB jump post when the majority of the ash are all dead and gone or die off?
That's a good question. There is evidence that EAB is able to complete development in white fringe tree. So that's sort of the first non-ash host that we've seen EAB used. There's some research into whether or not it might jump to olive. And so that's another close relative, and thinking about EAB in Europe. And but from what I remember, that's not necessarily, it didn't do quite as well. But other than that, I haven't seen any other studies that have looked at this, and it seems unlikely that it will jump to other hosts. I think we would have seen it at this point if it was going to, but that's just my hypothesis.
Yeah. Mary just added in the chat, if you find a lingering ash tree, you can use the phone app Tree Snap to report it.
Nice.
And you can also look for and report healthy beech in Northeast Ohio and hemlock in Southeast Ohio. So thank you, Mary. Good information to share. Okay, Anne is asking if there is a graphic comparing the effectiveness of chemical treatment on different types of ash. She's seeing some more effectiveness on green than on white or purple.
Not that I am aware of. That's a very interesting observation. I'm not sure.
Raymond is asking, with current populations of EAB, is continued treatment of ash trees with insecticides recommended? I think you already mentioned that.
Yes.
Okay, yes, go ahead and treat your trees. All right. Mark is asking, are some beetle species shifts from closed canopy to ash canopy gaps considered in the realm of expected arthropod shifts with a physical forest structural change?
Great question.
Yeah.
And I would say yes. So if we weren't looking, if my study wasn't focused on ash, but I was looking at, gaps created by some other tree species, I would predict that we would find similar results. Forest species may not be using the gaps as much. We'll see an increase in open habitat or generalist species. I don't necessarily think those responses are specific to ash in particular. The unique part of this phenomenon is the scale at which it's happening. And so, at least at this point in time, we're not seeing, another species within the forest that is dying off, at least not yet, quite at the scale as ash. And so it's the fact that it's happening very simultaneously across an entire forest stand, and that's could be potentially impacting, what's happening at the landscape scale in terms of these insect populations, their behavior, things like that. But as those gaps close, I would also predict that, forest species would begin utilizing that habitat again. We would see, open habitat and generalist species maybe retreat from those sites.
Okay. Somebody's asking about the resistant traits of the Manchurian ash. Do you deeper dive into any of those things that or is there anything that really allows it to survive better alongside EAB?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, that's not my expertise. But so maybe if someone knows more, they can chime in. But it's my understanding that obviously there's been a lot of work done looking at sort of the mechanism of resistance in Manchurian and sort of what's lacking in the North American species. And like I said, it's my understanding, without this being my expertise, that they've gotten close, but they haven't quite pinpointed exactly what it is. But the working hypothesis is that it's protein based, I believe. If anybody is currently working on that, maybe drop it in the chat, give us a little more information.
Okay. Lots of questions about the tolerance of, well, a few questions to blue ash.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead.
I'm not exactly sure what that mechanism is for blue ash, but a lot of people have reported that for some reason blue ash is less susceptible to EAB, although it still will, decline and succumb to EAB in some situations. It's not like they're totally resistant, but it tends to do better or die more slowly. And in some cases, like our common garden, it's looking beautiful. People have looked into the phylogenetic relationship of blue ash with Asian species and the North American species, and there's a lot of people working on mechanisms of resistance, but I said, that's not necessarily my expertise.
A few additional comments from Mary back when we were talking European ash and if they're more resistant. She said, yes, they are sort of intermediate, but there aren't many European ash in the US to test. And then in regards to the Manchurian ash, that genetics question, she said that they did put EAB eggs on trees, and the Manchurian ash tends to kill more larvae very early than green or white and white ash. But what that is chemically is not very well understood. So Yeah, so many questions.
I know. It's exciting though.
It is. Yeah.
I like, the question.
Yeah.
Following a question.
So Alan is asking, in the absence of ash trees, how do I help the oaks compete with the maples in my woodlot without using fire?
Oh my
It's kind of a
goodness.
non.
I was gonna
Yeah,
say,
I don't.
Fantastic
I'm not
question,
sure.
Alan, though. Very. Yeah.
Yeah. Kathy, do
You're-
you have any thoughts?
well, so the bottom line between oaks and maples is that maples are shade tolerant. So they can exist in the understory with very little light and continue to grow and become dominant. Oaks need full sunlight. And so it's a matter of giving young oaks enough sunlight to outcompete those maples. Now, on some sites, as always, sites make a difference, and you may have some sites that are much more maple sites than they are oak sites. And so you can do all the work you want, but the maples will thrive and the oaks will struggle for some species of oaks versus some species of maples. So there's a lot of variables that go into that, but bottom line, when you're talking those two species, you're talking a maple species that's shade tolerant and an oak species that wants lots of sunlight.
Sometimes you got to get rid of the maple competition too,
Right.
to help those oaks establish along with that sunlight.
Right. If the site is a good site for oak, right?
Yeah.
So if it's not the right conditions for oak, you can do all the work you want, but they're just kind of sit there and do their thing at a very slow pace. So there's a lot of forestry help out there. I would recommend that you talk to someone on site and look at what you've got and try to make the right choices management wise to favor what you're trying to favor.
Okay. Tim is asking, for retention of a young tree, would you recommend starting treatments at 1 inch DBH?
That would definitely be the most conservative approach. The alternative is to keep a close eye on it. And once you see any potential damage, to then treat it, when you observe that. But if you really value it, yes.
And roughly how much does it cost to treat an ash tree per inch diameter?
I am not sure. That's a great question. I don't have any ash trees, so I have not treated them myself. But yeah, that's a great question. How, so the way you decide to treat them, whether it's a soil drench or an injection, is going to affect the price, because some you can do by yourself, others you have to have someone professionally apply those insecticides. So there are a lot of things that go into, I guess, how much that costs.
Yeah.
The size of the tree too.
Andrea is asking about the susceptibility of Fraxinus profunda, which is that pumpkin.
Yeah, I am not sure necessarily. It is susceptible, more susceptible than blue ash. As far as I know, less susceptible than black. So it falls in there somewhere. There isn't a lot. There's some in Ohio, but not a lot. So that hasn't necessarily been part of any of our studies. Maybe someone else might have a better answer to that.
It's a pretty rare
Mm-hmm.
tree in the native. I mean, I know where maybe one or two are when I worked in Western Ohio, but they were like individual trees, not great numbers of them. So they're not abundant.
We have a patch of old growth forest around here somewhere, like east of Worcester, and I know there are a few there. And then I have a colleague that just started at Louisiana State, and I think pumpkin ash is something that he's interested in looking at, but I don't think he's started any projects on that yet.
Okay. Second, just making sure we have enough time to get through some of the questions we haven't touched on. I will say real quick that Annette mentioned that Oakland Nursery in Columbus will take requests for a specific plant. It's just a question of if they can find it in production. And I think that was in reference to some of those hybrids we were talking about. It may not be profitable enough for the growers at this time, so that might be why we can't find them. So thanks,
Yeah,
Annette,
and
for coming in on
I
that.
did search some of our nurseries online and nobody lists ash as an option.
Yeah. Okay. Anne saying, I had a fence row cleared of ash preventatively. They grew back and are now about 5 inches in diameter and not affected. Strong roots make a difference? Don't know.
Where's that question at?
I skipped down a little
Okay.
bit.
Okay,
Is that
sorry, I've been
1138?
following
Yeah.
along.
Yes.
Oh, I
Just
see.
wondering if the roots make a difference in, you know, how susceptible or not they are.
I'm not sure. If you're treating them, they might have an effect on, you know, uptake of insecticide, for example, if you have strong roots. But I'm not sure if I don't think roots necessarily are going to affect the susceptibility of the tree as a whole.
And Kayla, I'll add that Mary put in pumpkin ash is fairly closely related to green and similar in resistance.
Okay. So susceptible.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah.
She's so cheery.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, Christine is saying that she has a tree service that wants to fertilize her ash tree. It has been treated for EAB, and she's wondering if fertilizing it is going to make it more susceptible.
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily make the recommendation to fertilize it. I would just stick with treating it and just keep an eye on it from there, personally. But maybe you can get a little more information from them on why they're making that recommendation.
Good advice. And I think Anne is referring to a question we had earlier about the cost of treating. She said that she pays about $1,000 for injection every other year for 4 ash trees, which are about 2 inches in diameter. So thanks, Anne,
okay, so the injection costs a little bit more money. Sounds like you're probably using ivermectin benzoate every other year because it's really effective. But yeah, it is an investment if you want to keep those trees alive.
Great. Okay, so I think we are about there. There's another question about a specific caterpillar waved sphinx moth on the trunk of an ash tree that they have been treating, and they're wondering how it's still alive if the insecticide does make it to the leaves.
Well, that's a great question. So have you seen you've seen the caterpillar there? Like so there's a population and you've seen the caterpillars multiple years in a row. Yeah, I'm not sure. So it's possible that you know, these insecticides have sort of different effects on different insect taxa. And so, you know, EAB is a beetle. Caterpillars are Lepidoptera. And so it's possible that, you know, the level of impacts from feeding on leaves with these systemic insecticides is going to vary among taxa. I haven't looked at that in particular, but that's a great question.
Okay. If ash trees make up 10% of a forest prior to EAB, does another tree species take advantage of the opening?
Yeah, so we would expect that those gaps that are created by the death of ash trees are going to be filled over time by other tree species. We've talked a little bit about, you know, maples and oaks. There's some predictions that maples will take over. You know, it depends what's surrounding that tree and the size of the gap. So if it's just one ash tree that dies, it's possible that the mature trees that are surrounding it will sort of just grow laterally to fill that gap. But if it's multiple ash trees that sort of die in a cluster, that gap's much larger. And so that gives the, you know, opportunity for sort of understory trees to potentially grow up and utilize that light. for example, potentially oaks, to then fill that gap. So it depends on the particular situation, you know, what's already in the forest, the size of the gap, and things like that. But yeah, I would like to investigate some of those questions in Michigan to see what species have filled the gaps, because it's likely that those gaps are already closed at this point. In those forests.
Well, in some cases, at least in my woods where I lost the ash,
Mhm.
the multiflora rose, the burning bush are
Mhm.
coming in the understory and really giving other tree species a run for their money to try to fill those gaps with trees. So
Yeah, that's a good point. If there's high invasive pressure, they can certainly take advantage
yeah.
of those gaps and those resources.
All right, the last question. I think we went through over 50 questions.
That's
Wow.
Woo! Where have all the parasitoids been released? So has there, I imagine somebody's keeping track of it, but I wonder if it's.
Yeah, I think
the public.
didn't Mary post a link in the chat about?
She had a map. Yeah.
Did she post a map?
Well, it was like map dot.
Oh, the biocontrol.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's
It is map biocontrol.
I wonder if that'll. Oh yeah.
Ah, there you go.
Very cool. Okay, so Eastern.
Yep, she just said again, yeah,
Midwestern
Map
US.
Biocontrol website. Thank you, Mary.
Very cool.
Excellent.
So quite widely distributed.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's awesome. Cool. All right. Well, I'm at this point going to stop recording. Kayla, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Yes.
And Kathy
you.
will put the link to credits in the chat box. So thank you so much.